Hello, can everyone hear me okay? I think we're about to get started, so if everyone could take their seats. All right, could everyone take their seats? We'll be getting started in just a minute. Oh, you guys can sit over. We have reserved seats for you guys there if you want before we start. Yes. Hello, everyone. My name is Calvin Wilder. I'm an analyst on the Non-State Actors Program at the New Lines Institute for Strategy and Policy and the co-author of Opportunities for De-Escalation in the Kurdish-Turkish Conflict, which we are pleased to be releasing in print today. On behalf of the New Lines Institute and the Kurdish Peace Institute, it's my pleasure to introduce this timely discussion on Turkey's rapidly approaching elections and their implications for U.S. policy on the broader Turkish-Kurdish conflict in Iraq, Syria, and Turkey. If this is your first time joining New Lines for an event, welcome. We're really happy to have you here. New Lines was founded in 2019 with a vision for enhancing U.S. foreign policy based on a deep understanding of the geopolitics of different regions of the world and their value systems. We strive to help policymakers in Washington understand both the constraints they face and the opportunities they have to tilt the scales towards de-escalation and peace in conflicts across the world. For that reason, we are thrilled to be hosting this event today. We hope that this discussion will provide new insights into how the Turkish-Kurdish conflict has changed and expanded since the collapse of Turkish peace talks with the Kurdistan Workers' Party, or the PKK, since 2015, and into what role Washington can play in de-escalating the violence that has now spread into northern Iraq and Syria and disrupted U.S. policy towards those countries in dramatic ways. After 8 years of Turkey attempting to settle the so-called Kurdish question by force, one of the biggest questions on everyone's mind this week is whether this round of elections will lead to a new Turkish and domestic and foreign policy approach to Kurdish issues. The Turkish-Kurdish conflict has emerged as a hot-button issue in this election, with current President Recep Tayyip Erdogan accusing the challenger Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu of running for president with the support of Ken Deal, a thinly veiled reference to the Kurdistan Workers' Party's headquarters in northern Iraq. The two lead contenders for the presidency offer sharply diverging approaches to the Kurdish question, with stark implications for policymakers in Washington. But Turkey's Kurdish question is not only about domestic politics, but also how Turkey should approach Kurdish-led political and social movements in Iraq and Syria. For that reason, we are truly honored and delighted to be joined today by General Joseph Votel, the former commander of CENTCOM from 2016 to 2019. Under General Votel's leadership, the U.S. relationship with the Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces in northern Syria went from a nascent alliance to oust ISIS from its Syrian strongholds to a more enduring partnership to stabilize that territory against future threats. That relationship, however effective at achieving U.S. objectives within Syria, also brought U.S.-Turkey relations to a new low and highlighted how Turkey's so-called Kurdish question has become an international issue that impacts broader U.S. security objectives in the Middle East. Since 2016, Turkey has launched 3 separate offensives into Syria against the Syrian Democratic Forces and affiliated groups, 2 of which took place during General Votel's leadership of CENTCOM. These offensives have brought a NATO ally into direct conflict with a U.S.-trained and equipped force and threatened to end the U.S.-led mission to defeat ISIS in Iraq and Syria. Few have had as comprehensive of a look on the human toll of Turkey's offensives against the Syrian Democratic Forces or the long-term impact this conflict has had on the United States security objectives in the region than General Votel. For that reason, we are very, very excited to be welcoming General Votel to be giving a keynote speech, and his remarks will be followed by an all-star panel discussion on this topic moderated by New Line's senior non-resident fellow, Miles Kaggans. General Votel, thank you again for joining us today.
Well, thank you. It's great to be here. It's good to see some old friends in the room. I'm very, very appreciative, Megan, of the invitation to come here today, and look forward to engaging with you today. Let me start off by just offering my congratulations to the Kurdish Peace Institute and New Lines Institute for Strategy and Policy on this joint report, focusing on how the U.S. can engage in resolving the Turkish-Kurdish conflict in order to promote regional stability and support some long-term partners that we've had on the ground here. As I mentioned, I'm very, very happy to be here today and to speak in support of this report, and especially in support of our Kurdish and SDF partners. Partners that I got to know quite well during my time leading the coalition campaign against the Islamic State, with a lot of help from my military colleagues. Many of you are aware of how our relationship with the YPG and the YPJ and eventually the SDF got started. In the dark days of ISIS, Syrian Kurdish fighters literally had their backs against the border in Kobani, with an unfriendly and unsupportive Turkish military to the north, and ISIS surrounding them on all three sides. The fighting was vicious and was well documented. Many of you are familiar with the stories of this fighting and the stories of heroism that emerged from it. The destruction was immense, and while today we have a tendency to think of destruction in terms of what we see in Ukraine, I can assure you that the destruction in Kobani and many other places was maybe not to the same scale as we see, but it certainly had the same impact on the population that we are witnessing in other places now. We were introduced to the YPJ and YPG leadership through our partners in the Kurdish region in Iraq, and especially through the Sulaymaniyah-based PUK. The existential circumstances of the situation around Kobani was compelling to the Obama administration, and they authorized us to share intelligence and provide limited support to the Kurds in Syria. Our partners in Sulaymaniyah connected us with General Mazloum and his other leaders and officers, and through our very innovative special operations forces, we were able to devise a communication system largely built around cell phones and the internet that allowed us to support them in their defense of Kobani. This was an extraordinary relationship, unlike any other that we had had up to this point in the so-called global war on terrorism. And we were successful in pushing back ISIS and regaining a lot of contested space in the northern areas of Syria. This was a model. We learned very quickly that this was a model for partnering that could be replicated even further. The success of the Kobani breakout led to a serious consideration that perhaps the YPJ and the YPG could be our partners on the ground in Syria as we search for ways to defeat the so-called ISIS caliphate. And as many of you will recall, we had looked for a long time for partners on the ground in Syria and had an aborted attempt with Arab militias that just did not pan out. So we were in dire straits looking for a partner there. There was extensive debate about this in the U.S. National Security Council. After a very difficult period and process of trying to find Arab partners who could help us with this campaign against ISIS, we arrived at the conclusion that the Syrian Kurds would be the force around which we would pursue our efforts to defeat the caliphate in Syria. And it's important to appreciate, I think, that the decision by the Obama administration in 2015 to make the Syrian Kurds and eventually the SDF our partners was sustained by the Trump administration in 2017. Two successive U.S. administrations committed to this partner on the ground. The YPG was supportive of this notion, and with some advice from the U.S. side, adopted the concept of partnering their forces with local Arab militias. And thus, the Syrian Democratic Force was born. My first visit to northern Syria occurred in the spring of 2016. As a recently installed U.S. Central Command Commanding General, I was fortunate to be the first senior U.S. officer and government official to meet in person with the SDF leadership in Syria, and in particular with our main partner, General Mazloum Abdi. In our first meeting, we talked about the situation. We spent an extraordinary amount of time talking about that. But we also talked about how our partnership would evolve. From the U.S. side, we emphasized that our focus was specifically on ISIS and not on the Syrian regime. As difficult as this was for the Syrian Democratic Forces, because they had suffered at the hands of the regime, they accepted this condition. And this immediately marked them as different from any other partners that we had been pursuing. Our very responsive support to them in Kobani had set the table for an extraordinary relationship that largely continues to this day. My nearly 2-hour meeting with Mazloum was followed by a tour of Kobani City, where I witnessed what must have been nearly every citizen in the city outside working to recover from the damaging of a devastating battle against ISIS. Much of the city was destroyed, and in many cases completely. This had little diminishment on the attitude or spirit of the people that I saw and met. I visited several areas where the fighting with ISIS was thickest and heard firsthand the stories of YPG and YPJ fighters who gave their last full measure defending the town. The town was adorned with pictures and tributes to those killed in the fighting, to include a recently installed statue of a YPJ fighter at a prominent traffic circle in the town. It was an extraordinarily influential visit for me and my team, and by the time I left, I knew that we were going to succeed in our campaign against ISIS in Syria, even though we had 3 years to go, exclusively because of the partners that we had in the Syrian Democratic Forces. As an experienced commander, General Mazloum was keen to focus on what they might get from their partnership with the U.S.-led coalition. Our U.S. response, was that their commitment to support this campaign would allow them to have a seat at the table for an eventual political settlement, meaning that a grateful United States and coalition would ensure the interests of the Syrian Kurds would be represented in the political dialogue, a commitment that remains unfulfilled to this day, largely due to the breakdown of the political process. Over the 3 years of my time in command of U.S. CENTCOM, I met with General Mazloum and his leaders dozens of times, almost every month. As a lifelong special operations and combat arms officer, I never experienced a better relationship with any partner that I ever worked with. They were not only extraordinary fighters, but they did a lot to foster stability in the liberated areas of the north and east of Syria. They installed and supported local political leadership. It wasn't perfect, but it was sufficient to the need. It was inspiring to visit cities like Manbij and Raqqa, to witness the early steps of returning stability and normalization to this area. They stayed focused on ISIS throughout the entire campaign, and they communicated with us on matters of strategic importance, including outreach from the Russians, from the Iranians, and from the Syrian regime that occurred quite frequently throughout our time there. And they sacrificed mightily on their behalf and, of course, on ours. By the time we completed the final battle of the campaign at Baghouz in late March of 2019, the SDF had lost over 11,000 fighters in the campaign. The U.S. side and coalition lost less than 5. The success of this campaign and its utility as a model for the future has been documented extensively in professional literature, and it was very evident to us throughout. This was not an easy campaign for the Syrian Kurds, the SDF, or the U.S. coalition. During the conduct of the campaign, they had to contend with not infrequent incursions by Turkish forces and their partners, most notably the invasion of Afrin, an ethnically Kurdish dominant area in March of 2018, significantly threatened our campaign. This was repeated several other times as the Turks threatened operations against Manbij and sought to create a so-called buffer zone along the border with Syria. We worked hard to engage our NATO allies and keep the campaign on track. This was a whole of U.S. government effort to do that, not just me, but my counterpart combatant commanders, the Joint Staff, the Secretary of Defense, and of course the Department of State. Turkish interference was not limited to physical intervention. As a senior military headquarters, we contended multiple times with Turkish proposals to replace the Syrian Democratic Forces with a force of their choosing, which we and the Turks were largely unable to ever demonstrate actually existed. Turkish concerns about equipment and supplies being provided to the SDF resulted in an elaborate system of providing them exquisite transparency into the materials that we were providing to the Syrian Democratic Forces. Throughout the campaign, our military efforts were well supported by the President's Special Envoy for the defeat of ISIS, Mr. Brett McGurk. Backed up with experienced diplomats on the ground, this was a powerful partnership between the military and the Department of State and represented all the basic ingredients to deliver on our promise to the Syrian Kurds to ensure they had a place at the table. Unfortunately, the collapse of the UN process and the failure of any other process to bring together all the necessary parties has left our Kurdish partners in limbo. In 3 years as a CENTCOM commander, I never had any instance to believe that our SDF partners were not acting in our joint interests. They were aware and respected our relationship with NATO partner Turkey and recognized that any operation or activity emanating from them or the areas in which they controlled that resulted in an attack on our allies would be a red line, which would have dire impacts on the campaign and for them. And they never gave me any reason to be concerned about that. The Syrian Democratic Forces continue to be an extraordinary partner today, working closely with the U.S. partners to conduct operations against the remnants of ISIS and their emergent leadership. They continue to safeguard thousands of detained ISIS foreign fighters and tens of thousands of ISIS family members in camps across northern Syria. And they continue to lose fighters doing all of these things. As they continue this support, they also hold out hope that eventually there can be a political solution that addresses their interests and helps safeguard their population. This has placed them into uneasy relationships with a number of strategic partners and actors: the Russians, the Syrians, the Iranians, and yes, I would add the Americans to that list. This is where the work of organizations like the Kurdish Peace Institute and the New Lines Institute for Strategy and Policy come to the forefront. As the late former Secretary of Defense Ash Carter used to often say to us, it's never too late to do the right thing. Pursuit of a political solution would have a number of very positive benefits. It would, first and foremost, fulfill a promise we made to the Syrian Kurds at the start of the Defeat ISIS campaign. Our partners believed us, and speaking on behalf of those in uniform at the time, we believed we would follow through with a political solution. Secondly, it would help restore some U.S. prestige in the region, although this may have become more difficult over the weekend as the Arab League voted to readmit the Syrian regime into its ranks. My hope is that this perhaps pragmatic decision by the Arab countries can be parlayed into a meaningful dialogue on Kurdish interests. A political solution would also provide a platform upon which issues surrounding the disposition of foreign fighters and ISIS family members could be addressed and ultimately resolved. A political solution in Syria would also go a long ways towards creating a model that could be used more broadly for Kurds in other countries or perhaps other subjugated ethnic populations. I admit, however, that I am concerned that our seeming lack of national resolve on this topic does not bode well for our Kurdish partners. I am concerned that a normalization of relationships with the regime will not lead to further examination of their means and methods, but in fact lead to an examination of our means and methods. Our continuing presence on the ground in very, very small numbers contributes to stability. ISIS operations have been reduced nearly 40% in Syria over the last year and 80% in Iraq, where U.S. and coalition forces partner with the Syrian Democratic Forces and with their colleagues in Iraq. We cooperate and collaborate quite effectively. And by the way, it's important to note that ISIS is thriving in regime-held areas of Syria, recently defeating a joint Russian-Syrian counteroffensive and killing over 115 people in April alone. The consequences of a full U.S. withdrawal from Syria would be catastrophic. I think we should also note that the Assad regime has a long-established history of weaponizing and supporting jihadists. I know from my own personal experience in Iraq in the 2003 to 2011 period, they facilitated the movement of foreign fighters into that country, and they continued to do that throughout this campaign. It's important to note that leading voices in Congress, including that of the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, have called for a revision to our current policy towards Syria, with a hope to resolve the longstanding challenges to security and stability that are affecting the Kurdish people. The disposition of detained ISIS foreign fighters and their family members is precarious at best, and we often read about revolts and attacks emanating from these camps. And as many have noted, these groups bear the seeds of the next insurgency that will not only affect Syria, but indeed the region and beyond. I applaud the efforts of the Kurdish Peace Institute and the New Lines Institute to keep focus on this strategic issue. A political settlement provides the best chance for stability in northeast Syria and for restoring strong U.S.-Turkey relationships. These two goals are not mutually exclusive. We can do both. It's not a choice of one or the other. We can do both, and a political settlement allows us to pursue that. We must be prepared, however, to continue to apply pressure to prevent violence and instability, and to take advantage of political developments like were cited a little bit earlier with the PKK. Review our own policies and take advantage of strategies that can serve as platforms for moving forward. Again, I am honored to be here with you this morning to talk on this important topic and lend my support to the important and timely work of the Kurdish Peace Institute and the New Lines Institute for Strategy and Policy. Thank you very much.
This over here. Okay. Good morning. Great and prescient remarks by General Votel. Sometimes when we get these outstanding speakers at New Lines Institute and the Kurdish Peace Institute, we are really appreciative of the depth and breadth of the experience, and that he was in the room when many of these issues came to bear over the past 8 years in the fighting ISIS and also the ongoing Turkish-Kurdish conflict in the region. I'm very proud to moderate a panel today. We have 3 all-stars who I get to share the stage with, so it is my honor to introduce them, and I'll work them from closest to me toward the end. Seated next to me is Meghan Bodette. She is the Director of Research at the Kurdish Peace Institute, and she is a graduate of Georgetown School of Foreign Service. Meghan is a prolific writer, and I encourage all of you to read the recent report on opportunities for de-escalation with the Kurdish conflict. She co-wrote this piece with Calvin Wilder of the New Lines Institute, and is available online, and those who are present, you get a copy to take home with you. Meghan has recently returned from a visit to Iraqi Kurdistan and also north and east Syria, also known to some as Rojava, where she conducted field research that will come. You'll hear a little bit about that today, and you'll see it in forthcoming reports. To her right is Dr. Sinan Sidi. He is an expert in Turkish internal politics. He's been educated in London all the way through his PhD, and he has, in the United States, led research and discussions at Georgetown University, as well as the University of Florida, and he's currently a professor of national security studies at the United States Marine Corps University. He recently published a report for the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. The report is titled, Turkey After Erdogan. We'll see if that comes to bear. And my friend, Dr. Bilal Wahab. He's a senior fellow at the Washington Institute, and he was educated at Saladin University, as well as the American University here in Washington and George Mason University, where he earned his PhD. He was one of the very first Iraqis to be a Fulbright Fellow, and he is renowned throughout the nation's capital as one of the foremost experts on Kurdish affairs. So welcome to our panelists today, and thank you all for your attention. Let's get into it. There's an election happening soon. In fact, some Turkish people, Turkish citizens in America have already voted, as well as other places around the world with their absentee voting process. We love to bring you all into predictions, and right now the polls are neck and neck. What do we think will happen in terms of the outcome of the election? Where do we think that the trends are going with the voting? I'll start with you, Megan. Who's going to win?
Well, I think that we can look at polls, but we can't do too much speculation. And I think that the issues that we're discussing today are both incredibly relevant to these elections and also issues that go much deeper into the very social fabric and the composition of the Turkish state. So we're talking about these elections, we're talking about Northeast Syria, and at the heart of all of these issues is Turkey's century-old, what we would call the Kurdish question. You know, this debate over and struggle for what degree of inclusion and equality and equal citizenship rights the Kurdish minority in Turkey will have. Of course, with the founding of the modern Turkish nation state on a very nationalist slant that resulted in the denial of the existence of the identity of any Kurdish population in Turkey. And that led to campaigns of state repression, to Kurdish uprisings. And the most recent phase of that is the armed conflict between the government of Turkey and the PKK, which began in 1984 and has gone on intermittently up until now. And so this conflict and the broader issue of Kurdish civil and political rights behind it is at the center of what's going on in Northeast Syria. You know, Turkey's strategic perception that the existence of a Kurdish autonomous region poses an existential threat to the very project of its nation state. It's also central to the elections because we know that the Kurdish vote in Turkey, the Kurds who support the pro-Kurdish political movement running as the Green Left Party due to the closure case against the HDP, could be decisive in tipping the balances to lend Erdogan his first defeat in 20 years, just like they were decisive in the Istanbul municipal elections in 2019. So all of these issues are going back to this Kurdish question, and we're seeing that, you know, the pursuit of militaristic policies against the Syrian Kurds, the pursuit of a military solution to the conflict with the PKK, and the repression of those Kurdish voices who choose civilian politics, who choose to participate legally and peacefully through parties like the HDP, through Kurdish civil society, you know, the repression, the imprisonment, the, you know, essentially show trials against Kurdish politicians and civil society activists. This has created an opportunity for a great deal of instability, and this is at the center of all of these issues. So that's why we're talking about that today. I think that if everything were free and fair, the opposition, based on the polls, some showing a slight lead, could win. But I think we have to face the very real possibility that everything will not be free and fair, and that the tactics that Turkish governments have used against their Kurdish citizens and their other ethnic and religious minority citizens for decades may now be used against anyone who disagrees with prolonging Erdogan's rule. And the polls are very close. He may win outright. But if there is a change, the Kurdish issue is clearly at the center of these elections with the decisive role that Kurdish voters could play. And the fact that a new government has sent some signs that it might be willing to de-escalate slightly, both domestically in terms of lifting some of the repression and potentially in terms of a less aggressive policy in Syria. And we've seen signs, and as you can read in the report, and we can get into this later, that Kurdish political and military actors and the US are aware of this, and some diplomacy is going on. And that if we do see a new government, which is a possibility, that could lead to some change in the way that these issues are addressed.
Sinan, for you, you've recently written about Turkey after Erdogan, and a lot of our discussion today will be about Turkish and Kurdish issues. But beyond that, what other factors are driving the election? Perhaps will voters be more motivated by the Turkish government's response to the earthquakes, or the high rate of inflation in Turkey, or maybe even other issues, including how President Erdogan changed from a parliamentary system to a presidential system, and concerns that there's too much power centralized in the presidency. What other factors are motivating voters inside of Turkey.
Well, thank you for having me. General Votel, sir, you probably won't remember me, but back just before you were shipping out to Syria, I had the privilege of coming down to Tampa and talking to you and your officers amongst a group of people about what to expect, or in a series of briefings, and it's a privilege to hear you reflect on some of your experiences and just the sort of strategic board going forward. So first of all, thank you for everything that you've done, and it's a miracle, but also a reflection of good planning, just to sort of see where we are as a Western Hemisphere vis-a-vis the fight against the Islamic State, but also what continues to press ahead in terms of permanently eliminating the threat. So thank you. Yeah, great questions. I would say there are a lot of factors, I think, that are weighing on the mind of Turkish voters, but also its expectations and the realistic prospect of what can be achieved, even if President Erdogan is defeated in these upcoming polls. For my part, at this point, I'm going to borrow the reflections of a close colleague of mine who basically said at this point, the outcome of these elections on Sunday is about as predictable as a runoff between two big soccer teams in Turkey, Fenerbahce and Galatasaray. I mean, it's a football, analogy in the sense that it's so close and it's so evenly matched that I really don't see any predictable sort of outcome at this point. Anything could happen. I will say for my part, though, if we do not have a decisive result either way on Sunday, my prediction or my sense is that a second round of voting, which will be held on May 28th, will be to the advantage of President Erdogan. I think it will give him the ability and the time to essentially really impress upon his supporters and take advantage of the trappings of incumbency to put this forward. But it's also a reflection that we should bear in mind that there are 6 political parties trying to unseat one man. I mean, and even at this stage, it's neck and neck. All the things that you just mentioned in terms of the headwinds that Erdogan is facing, whether it's the economic calamity that awaits Turkey, the level of inflation, the depreciation of the currency, lack of foreign currency reserves in the central bank, corruption. On top of that, the fallout from the earthquake. Turks are finding it difficult to purchase the basic staples such as potatoes and onions, which some are making a joke of. But despite that, Erdogan is still in the fight. We could very well see him end up being the president for the next 5 years. That being said, I should also temper this, and I said this last year, just based on his appearance physically. Even if he does win this election one way or another, fair or unfair, I can see him occupy the office for a year or 2. But just given his physical state, I can't see another 5 being able to continue. And that's not any sort of insider information based on being privy to his medical sort of status, but you don't really have to be. You just have to look at him, particularly since his medical scare last week, which is a roundabout way of saying if he does prevail, I think he will be in the business of trying to name a successor, which opens up a whole series of other doors, which I don't think the regime in Turkey is able to determine because it really has no experience in doing this. And also regional powers such as Egypt have magnanimously failed in being able to attempt to do that. So that's by the by. There is a sizable portion of civil society in Turkey which is willing to take this to the streets if necessary, especially if there is a heightened sense that the election is going to be stolen from underneath them. I think it's meaningful, despite all the sort of keeping at arm's distance. The HDP in Turkey has continued to support the opposition alliance, even if they have not been formally included, which speaks volumes for the headwind that Erdogan will face going forward into this election on Sunday. I will also say some of the things that are sort of unknown sort of factors. One big unknown for me, and if anybody has any insider information on this, I'd be more than happy to listen. What will be the status of earthquake-stricken zones in Turkey in terms of people's ability to vote? I have no idea to what extent they will have access to the ballot box. There seems to be very little information coming out on this. There is there are instances of political violence motivated by pro-government circles that we've seen in the past week or so. My fear is that they will escalate should the government feel that they're on the losing end of this, especially if it's too close to call on the night of the election. My most hopeful outcome is if the opposition and Mr. Kılıçdaroğlu has any ability to prevail, either in the first or second round, there has to be a clear margin of victory that's undisputable. Reason I say that is because just 3-4 years ago at the local election in Istanbul, the CHP, the main opposition party, which is fielding Mr. Kılıçdaroğlu, its mayoral candidate, Mr. İmamoğlu, won the ballot by about 15,000 ballots. The government invalidated that election and reran it, and this time the margin was greater, so he was lucky. So if that's anything to take stock from, we need a clear margin of victory. And finally, whoever is in charge, the Kurdish question in Turkey remains the most pivotal question to overcome in terms of human rights and democratization written large. I'll leave it with one sort of prediction suggesting if Mr. Kılıçdaroğlu wins, I think his hands are tied in the amount of openings he can present before voters as well as the Kurdish movement in Turkey, simply because Erdogan has done his best to sort of really vilify the Kurdish movement and sort of continue to securitize it around this sort of false narrative of terrorism.
Well, we're two doctors on the stage. Let's get your prognosis on the upcoming election, Dr. Bilal Wahab.
Well, first of all, thank you for your very generous introduction, and congratulations to Calvin and Meghan for their very timely report. And it's tough coming after the General's very insightful speech. But thanks for having me. So I don't make predictions about the past, let alone the future. It's a 50-50 toss-up. So we can probably just analyze, as my colleagues did, what could happen if it goes either way. I think 20 years is a long time. But some of the Kurdish opening, I think, just to put things in perspective, and I'm just picking up on what Sinan said, that the Kurdish question is not something new. It has come up in probably the priorities list, especially given the situation with the war against ISIS and the need for local partners in the post-Al-Qaeda war against ISIS. So it's more up there in the headlines of the New York Times and the Washington Post of the world. But this question actually goes back, there was a Kurdish issue before Erdogan as well. As a young man, I was once arrested in Istanbul for speaking Kurdish. It was a banned language. I was a kid. And that was a time where Erdogan wasn't even, I think he was mayor of Istanbul at the time. So basically this Kurdish question, it's not new and it's not something that Erdogan invented. You could even argue that for a while, the Kurdish situation under the AK Party rule actually got a lot better. Kurdish language was legalized. There were Kurdish language language departments at universities. The very Istanbul where I was arrested for speaking Kurdish, I ended up in 2015, I believe, speaking at a university where the language of the conference was entirely in Kurdish. I wasn't sure if people in the audience understood my dialect of Sorani Kurdish, but nonetheless, I thought it was quite phenomenal that here I am back in the city where I was arrested only 10 years ago for speaking Kurdish, speaking in Kurdish at the conference, which was about the future of the Kurdish situation. This was that brief honeymoon where the YPG was not yet the enemy of the Turkish state. So I was actually sharing a stage with Ilham Ahmed, who at the time was free to come to Istanbul and give speeches at universities, and now she is being pursued by drones because now the Turkish government sees her as a terrorist. So the point here is that yes, there was an opening and there was an episode, and I think the results gave the peace for the Kurds in Turkey a hope. But I think that hope started to intimidate the Turkish leader and the ruling party, and therefore they just did a 180. Again, the example of Ilham Ahmed being one of them, going from someone who's welcome in Istanbul to someone who's now being being chased by, by drones, not only in Syria, but even across the border in Sulaymaniyah, as we recently saw. Some of the, like TRT, the Turkish national TV, broadcast in Kurdish. So some of the taboos around being Kurdish and some of the old language about, the very word of Kurd being taboo, some of that was lifted in part by the Kurdish parties creating a political party, which again was allowed, in that kind of sweet, kind of short honeymoon that existed for the Kurds in Turkey. But the violence, the viciousness at times with which all of those, rights that were given were then taken back, I think has created that kind of vengeance. I mean, AK Party was counting on the Kurdish vote. Half of the Kurdish vote in the early elections went to AK Party. And some of the opening was that political calculation that, the Kurdish vote is a conservative vote, said, so yes, some of them are not going to vote for a Turkish party, let's say, for AK Party. But, the incumbency on the one hand, but also AK Party being a conservative religious party at its core, got it Kurdish vote. But then when that dynamic also changed, then the calculations of the AK Party also changed. So this is kind of my take on internal Turkish politics. But if I may go across the border to Iraqi Kurdistan for a few minutes. That was also kind of an interesting dynamic going there. There is a movie, there's a film, a documentary film that features Kani Khulam. It's about the US view of the Kurds. It's called Good Kurds and Bad Kurds. I guess good Kurds, bad Kurds. This is about basically the US policy toward the the political parties in the KRG versus the PKK in Turkey. But I think now we have a Turkish version of good Kurds and bad Kurds. So its own Kurds in Turkey being seen as the villain and trying to be marginalized, and their political parties are banned, and the Yeşil Party is created just to make sure that in case in the middle of the election, if HDP is being banned, they have a plan B. And then of course the situation in Syria has also taken a part of that 180 that Ankara did. But Iraqi Kurds are, in the eyes of Ankara, if the YPG and the PKK are the bad Kurds, or the HDP also the bad Kurds, the KRG are the good Kurds. There wouldn't be a KRG without Turkish patronage. The KRG that exists today, a region that is the most developed region in Iraq, a region that exports, until about a month ago, 400 to 500,000 barrels of oil a day. A region that has airports and has, all kind of that development. Well, that was done because of a special relationship between KRG and Turkey. And not just any Turkey, but Erdogan's Turkey. Because the Turkish government allowed the Kurdistan region to export that oil. And then much of that oil actually ended up being spent on buying Turkish goods and Turkish services. There are some 3,000 foreign companies in the KRG. Half of them are Turkish. There are between 20 to 30,000 Turkish citizens who do business and do work in the KRG. And much of that money that the KRG makes by selling the oil through Turkey ends up, again, being spent on Turkish goods and companies and trade. So this on the Kurdish side. It allowed for this to happen. It also created a sense of legitimacy because you had a new generation of Kurdish leaders who needed development rather than kind of a distant fight against Saddam Hussein as a source of legitimacy, especially as elections in the KRG became more and more meaningless. So development became a source of legitimacy for them. That regional patronage, I think a third point, also provided the KRG leaders with some leverage against Baghdad. So a dependence, independence basically, Kurdish independence in Iraq became less dependence on Baghdad by becoming more dependent on Ankara, a capital where the Kurdish, leverage is a lot less than the Kurdish leverage in Baghdad. But this relationship, these are the positive sides of the relationship. I mean, obviously for Turkey, it was also an opportunity to, especially with the Barzani, with the KDP, with the Barzani family, the KDP also garnered their support, as the good Kurds, so to speak. For winning the Kurdish votes inside Turkey. So, for example, for the first time in 2011, at the time, Prime Minister Erdogan visited Erbil and met with President Barzani of the KRG. At some point, the president of the KRG went and participated and spoke in a rally with Erdogan in Diyarbakir, in Mardin. And without actually the Kurdish flag being seen anywhere. So it was kind of a symbiotic relationship. And last time, I mean, I was in the KRG in March, and they are very nervous about where this election is going to go, because the relationship, this relationship, before I get to that, let me also talk about the risks. So this is not just a rosy picture. This relationship comes with a lot of risks for the KRG and for Turkey as well. For Turkey, the risk is that much of the PKK operation is now deep inside Iraqi Kurdistan. They're in the Kandil Mountains, and for them, so Kurdistan is not this kind of safe haven that Turkey can just walk in and out. So you see a lot of drone activities and assassinations by the Turkish intelligence deep inside the KRG. There are some 40 plus Turkish military outposts deep inside Iraq, some 5,000 soldiers or more being stationed there. And then these, Turkish attacks that get deeper and deeper inside the KRG and therefore result in more casualties has also created an embarrassment for the KRG, because usually, Turkish military attacks, drone attacks, kill civilians, tourists, and they basically you hear crickets out of Erbil, given the sensitivity of the relationship that I outlined earlier. So at times where there were protests at some point that actually burnt Turkish military vehicles, this creates an embarrassment and a pressure on the KRG for the nature of the relationship. So back to my story about March. They were very nervous about where this election is going to go, because the nature of the relationship is not a state-to-state relationship. It's a very personal relationship. So if the person on the Turkish side is gone, that will create a lot of anxiety on the KRG side.
Yeah. Well, last night I received a message from Polat Can. He is an intellectual in North and East Syria, and he might be seen as some in Ankara as a bad Kurd, as we're talking good Kurds and bad Kurds and the different perspectives for this discussion. And I want to read you something he said, Meghan, and if you could give for our attendees here and those watching around the world an overview of the recent claw operations in the physical conflict. But Polat Can, related to the elections in Turkey, he says, quote, "Regardless of who wins the upcoming elections, it is essential that the new government in Turkey recognize the rights of Kurdish communities in Syria and work toward a peaceful and just resolution to the conflict. This means engaging in genuine dialogue with Kurdish leaders, acknowledging the historical and ongoing injustices faced by Kurds, and taking concrete steps to address their grievances." Meghan, can you give us an update on what's been happening in, let's say, the past 24 months with military aggression from Turkey into Syria? And then also, the last time I saw you, we were in Erbil about a month and a half ago, and you were going in and out of Syria. I'd like to hear a little bit more about your trip into the region.
Of course. Well, for Polat Can, geleki spas jibo në khandina te gering. Thank you for your very important evaluation there. There's a lot of truth there, and there's a lot of important information about the Syrian Kurdish perspectives there. But yeah, essentially right now, the situation in northern Iraq and northern Syria is unsustainable. Bilal gave a great update as to the numbers on the Turkish military presence, but I want to take this to a little bit of the more human level. So in March, after I saw you in Erbil, I had the chance to make it up to Kandil, the Kandil Mountains between Iran and Iraq, and I made it to the village of Zergele, which, if you've heard of that village before, that is where on August 1st, 2015, after Erdogan had declared peace talks to be over and everything had sort of finally collapsed, which we could have a whole other event on how that happened, Erdogan's government launched massive bombing raids in Iraqi Kurdistan. And as they would continue to do for the next 8 years, they claimed they only targeted terrorists, but what they did in Zergele was bomb a peaceful little civilian village nestled in the mountains along a narrow road and a river full of beautiful farmland. When you're there in March, the fruit trees are blooming. It doesn't look like a war zone at all. But the local municipality, the People's Municipality of Kandil, has put a museum there to commemorate the civilians who were killed. I believe it was about 10 civilians killed there, and the victims of all Turkish and Iranian cross-border strikes in that region. And it was the only museum of its kind that I've ever seen, because in all of Iraq and Syria, there are a lot of memorials to the fallen in the battles against ISIS, in the fight for liberation from Saddam Hussein, the fight for Kurdish autonomy against many different enemies. As General Votel mentioned, in Kobani, you can't pass a street without seeing commemorations of the fighters fallen there. But in Zergele, I saw the only museum I think I've ever seen, the only commemoration of the civilian victims of these cross-border bombings. There are photos of these people. There are some of their belongings that there were preserved. And there are, messages dedicated to spreading the message of these people and the situation that civilians in Iraqi Kurdistan are facing to the world. You can still see the ruins of the houses. When you look at what US origin F-16 does to these tiny little village houses, it's just really, it's heartbreaking to see. There's a lot of devastation. But they've done this so that people remember. And being able to look at this, to read the stories of the civilians, to be able to match the locations and the plaques to roads that you'd been driving on the day before, it feels very serious. And monitors that have been reporting on this, statistics show that there have been thousands of civilian casualties in Turkish military operations in Iraq and Syria, a lot from airstrikes and drone strikes on populated areas. We can go back to Kobani again, where sort of in a very sad contrast to the very hopeful picture that General Votel painted of Kobani after the liberation, right now the people of Kobani, since 2019, they live in fear. I was in the village of Karamukh, which is right on the border between Kobani and Turkey. And if you've been there, you know that most of northeast Syria is flat, but by the time you get to Kobani, there are hills. And Karamukh is on the side of a hill that slopes down right towards the border. In the little valley, there's the border wall, and then on the other side, the next hill is in Turkey, and on that hill, there's a Turkish military point. And you can see, sort of looming over the city, this military point. Local officials with the local neighborhood assembly were showing me around, showing me damaged buildings. And I turned to take some pictures and make a video talking about this, and a group of school children run over, and they say, "Stop, don't film here, the Turks are going to shoot you." And we assure them that it's okay, that we've taken security precautions. The SDF wouldn't let people go out there if it were dangerous. But we decide, let's talk to them, let's see where they're going. And the kids say, "Okay, do you want to see our school?" And they take us to a school in the village that's all boarded up, it's closed, and they explain that they now get bused to school in another town because in November, when Turkey had escalated militarily and there were fears of another invasion, there was so much shelling and there were drone strikes in the village, there were injuries and civilian casualties there, that parents actually stopped sending their kids to school out of fear. So the autonomous administration now buses them to another village further from the border. In that same village, we spoke to a woman who was out picking spring greens with her family, and she said point blank to us that if you had come 4 or 5 weeks back, you wouldn't have seen any of us here. She said that when her family's house was shelled in November, they moved to the house of a relative living further back in the village, but then that house was shelled too, and that she and her relatives are now thinking very hard about where can they go, what can they do. And mind you, these are people who were displaced by ISIS and chose to come back and to rebuild their lives, and this is now the scenario that they're facing because of Turkish threats and Turkish air campaigns in these areas near the border. Even without the threat of a ground operation. So this is what it's like for civilians. It's this pervasive climate of uncertainty, of instability, of fear. And what I heard from a lot of people was that the uncertainty and lack of clarity in US policy was a driving force behind one of the reasons why they feel Turkey is able to destabilize and displace their communities. So this is something that's been really very difficult for civilians. And in terms of the most recent developments in the conflict that might lead to a chance of turning this around, notably in November, while there was some really devastating airstrikes and drone strikes, there was not a military operation. It's my assessment that it was US diplomacy that successfully prevented that in what we saw as a welcome improvement from previous times where maybe an incursion was not able to be prevented. And after that, I think that there were 2 very important changes in perception. I think that Washington understood that if you want to maintain a partnership with Turkey and maintain the enduring defeat of ISIS and a partnership with the Syrian Kurds, that the Kurdish issue must be addressed, that you have to stop separating Syria from this broader issue, this larger conflict. And I think we also saw from Kurdish decision makers a real awareness of the risks of, even this kind of military escalation. Because as we remember, the precipitating factor behind the escalation in November was the bombing in Istanbul that to this day we don't know very much about and has somehow disappeared from the Turkish media, despite one thinking that they would want to know what caused the death of 6 of their citizens and the injury of many others. Turkey immediately blamed this bombing on the PKK and the YPG. They made a bunch of ludicrous accusations about how the United States may have been involved and how the bomber came through Kobani.
With the New York sweatshirt.
Yes, with a purple New York sweatshirt and a full face of makeup and press-on nails, which, not exactly the profile of the sort of person that they were claiming that this individual was. She was not Kurdish. Nobody knew very much about her. And so Turkey immediately blamed this bombing on Kurdish groups. Süleyman Soylu called the US condolence message like the murderer arriving first at the crime scene. The US condemned it. He repeated it. He's a real piece of work in that way. But anyway, this, I think, on the Kurdish side, it made the importance of de-escalation. It put that at the forefront, the importance of protecting the civilian population of northeast Syria. Because even an action that the PKK did not do, that was blamed on the PKK, rather uncredibly with very, very flimsy evidence, led to loss of life for Syrian Kurds and disruption to Syrian Kurdish governance and security measures. And so we see after this, with elections coming up and a lot of fear of provocations, when the earthquake happened in Turkey, the PKK did something very unusual. They declared a unilateral partial ceasefire, stating that the need to prevent any military activity from interfering with the earthquake recovery was a necessary humanitarian measure for them to take. And on the surface, that made a lot of sense as the primary motivation. Certainly the areas that were impacted included a lot of Kurdish and Kurdish Alevi areas. Those are communities that have been very involved in pro-Kurdish politics and in the armed Kurdish movement as well. But when we looked at it more closely, we saw that there was a little bit more behind there. And shortly after the earthquake, when I was in Hasaka meeting with General Mazloum, he told me that some international actors had asked the SDF previously to convey to the PKK that the PKK ought to declare a ceasefire, and that if this were done, then the international community might be able to engage in diplomacy. And immediately that was very interesting. We know that in the immediate aftermath of the November escalation, General Mazloum wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post calling for the United States to support a political solution to the Turkey-PKK conflict, and very notably offering the SDF's help in getting negotiations started. So when I heard that when I was there, that was immediately something very interesting to me. And then later, speaking at a conference in the European Parliament, Ilham Ahmed said that the United States was one of those countries. And then in a video address to the Nowruz celebrations in Kandil, where I was for Nowruz, Cemil Bayik, who's the co-chair of the KCK and sort of the de facto day-to-day decision maker for the PKK, said that some parties and sides had asked for a ceasefire, but that when the ceasefire was declared, they then did not respond to it. So that was essentially an admission of the idea that there was some diplomacy going on there, and that acknowledgement from the Kurdish side was something very important. So we have this partial ceasefire, which was then extended through the elections, and they've said that they'll consider extending it after the elections. We have very credible allegations that some American diplomacy was involved, and we have a convergence of interest in both sides realizing that if you want to preserve the stability of northeast Syria, de-escalation leading towards a solution is necessary. So that's something new, and that's something that could change the trajectory of a lot of this and really provide, if that partial ceasefire were to be extended into something that Turkey also respected, something that could have a huge consequence for these civilians who've suffered so much. And my last point I'll add is that if you look at the fact that there has been no incursion into Syria, that it's not even a talking point in the campaign anymore, and that while typically in the spring there's a new Turkish military operation into Iraqi Kurdistan, while there's still a baseline level of Turkey-PKK clashes in Iraqi Kurdistan, there hasn't been one yet. We can say that this choice to de-escalate and this US diplomacy that might have factored into that have in some ways been very successful, because we're not talking about a fourth Turkish military incursion into Syria right now.
Thanks for your insights, and it sounds like you covered a lot of ground during your early spring trip. moving over to Sinan, I know you have a lot of thoughts on this. One thing that I'd like to hear from, as we're now transitioning to discussing the potential de-escalation of the Turkey-Kurdish conflict, if the election outcome has CHP winning, and CHP is backed by the mostly Kurdish party HDP, who's not running a candidate this time, do you think a CHP-led government would be able to de-escalate and change its approach towards Kurdish communities broadly, including citizens of Turkey as well as the PKK? And would that be possible now with all of the bureaucrats and judges and other officials that President Erdogan has placed in government?
It's a good question. Let me start out by saying I have a good amount of trust in the intentions of Mr. Kılıçdaroğlu should he become president, that he would like to do the right thing. Nevertheless, I have very little confidence in the nation alliance of 6 parties, especially with the senior partner in that, which would be the good party of Meral Akşener, really tugging at the sort of coattails of Mr. Kılıçdaroğlu and trying to sort of restrain his ability to move forward with a broader Kurdish opening. And therefore, I'm relatively pessimistic about the sort of a major transition into addressing this massive issue inside of Turkey's democratization platform, mainly because I think Mr. Kılıçdaroğlu will be tempted not to shake the boat and tempt the beast of being accused of being quote-unquote a terrorist lover by engaging with a new negotiated settlement over the Kurdish question inside Turkey. Now, if we zoom out, I would say that this is an inflection point for Turkey's democratic movement, or the re-democratization, if you could term it as that. It's an opportunity for Mr. Kılıçdaroğlu to lead, right, and not just appease the masses, which have been, I would argue, poisoned since the curtailment of the Kurdish peace process that Erdogan initiated and which he had a chance to capitalize upon. It's an opportunity for him to lead by making Turkey, and remembering that Turkey still has, in my opinion, the best chance of serving as a role model for the region, for where Kurds would want to live in peace at most, right? It would be a beacon to the Kurdish minority in Iran. It could be a beacon to the fate of the Kurds inside of Syria under the Assad regime, but also for the KRG, which is alive and well, but it's also bedeviled by its own problems of internal corruption, instability, and political infighting. I think Turkey has the ability and the opportunity under a Kılıçdaroğlu administration, if he should choose to take this on, right, to make Turkey a beacon where a negotiated settlement with broad sweeping constitutional guarantees, the desecuritization of the Kurdish question, would really, in my opinion, strengthen Turkey as a state, and stop it being undermined by sort of regional sort of thugs such as the Iranian leadership, right, trying to sort of agitate this issue inside of Turkey, and Turkey could instead be a beacon. But for that, Mr. Kılıçdaroğlu really needs to sort of think deep and and really think hard on this and act. In a comparable way to some of sort of Mr. Erdogan's overtures back in the day, right? When Mr. Erdogan was first elected, the biggest elephant he took on in the realm of foreign policy was the Cyprus question, right? He basically told the foreign ministry that they had to go back to the drawing board and reconsider their position because he was going to move on this. That 30 years of failed policies over Cyprus, which is not going to be continued. He was also instrumental in beginning the negotiated settlement with the Kurds inside of Turkey by opening direct talks with the PKK. And when he was severely criticized, his main response was, well, who do you want me to talk to? I mean, the state's policies or previous political actors' policies of trying to address the Kurdish question have failed. And so if you don't want me to talk to the PKK, who am I going to talk to? Right? So Kılıçdaroğlu has a huge opportunity to lead here. Vice, I would say, Erdogan, if he wins, he has no opportunity, I think, simply because I think he's missed it, right? I think if the Kurdish sort of political movement is skeptical, that skepticism probably has deeper roots now, in my opinion, that is comparable to Kurds' suspicions of the CHP that go back to the founding of the republic, and the brutal repression of Kurdish identity and massacres in places like Dersim and whatnot, right? I think Erdogan has no credibility on this issue. But if he should win, if he continues the path of securitization of this issue and really sort of playing to the hyper-nationalist sensitivities of demagoguery, then I think that's going to imperil his government even further. And finally, what I will say is there is also an opportunity for the United States here. Much has been sort of ruminated here in the corridors of Washington, thinking, was the United States at fault in partnering with the Syrian Kurds, with the SDF, or creating the SDF to battle against the Islamic State, given the damage that was going to do to its relationship with Turkey? And I was like, no, it was not a bad decision. I think we should double down on this, right? It has been the model of US involvement in the region without putting 200,000 boots on the ground. But more importantly, I would say, fundamentally partnering with a people that we will need to partner with again, and not desert in the field for reasons such as an ally, such as Turkey, saying that you're consorting with quote-unquote terrorists. It simply is not good enough, I think, for the United States to cower and sort of be bullied by Turkey because of arguments suggesting that we have bigger geopolitical considerations than just maintaining our partnership with the Kurds in the region writ large. I think, if anything, if Kılıçdaroğlu is elected, I think it presents a unique opportunity for the US government, this administration or subsequent one, to really work with Turkey in overcoming Turkey's differences or desecuritizing this issue of Syrian Kurds, the SDF, if we're going to get serious about continuing the war on terrorism in the Near and Middle East.
Thanks for that. This leads me to our last question for our panelists. Before we turn it over to you for your questions, it's important to hear your voices, what's on your mind, and we have this great panel of experts. Dr. Bilal Wahab. A few weeks ago, U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan came to your think tank, the Washington Institute, and he talked about America's approach toward foreign policy in the Middle East and North Africa. And he hailed Turkey's rapprochement with UAE and Israel, but as I read his remarks, he sidestepped Turkey's relationship with Iran and Russia vis-a-vis Syria. So you like to offer solutions. What advice would you have for the White House on how to influence Turkey on the Syria-Kurdish issue in light of Turkey's stated goal for U.S. forces to leave Syria and break its relationship with so-called terrorist group who in America we know as the Syrian Democratic Forces?
That's a tough question, Miles. It might be cliche for like anyone in Washington to say, but this is an inflection point because these elections really are a toss-up, as we have been saying. But it will have significant impact beyond Turkish borders. I talked earlier about the impact on Iraq and on the KRG. Thanks for bringing in and of course, a ton on Syria. Other dynamics that are going on in the region, which make it even ever more dynamic. The whole situation that is the detente between between Iran and Saudi Arabia, because one key element that made Turkey relevant and important and always, appeased at times in Washington is that Turkey is a major country that stands up to Iran and Iranian influence. I mean, you see that in Syria, you see that in Iraq, you see that in the region. Turkey and Saudi Arabia usually are seen as being the protectors of the Sunnis in the region, so to speak, as the Shia militias in particular, Iran proxies rise. So this has always given Turkey a bit of cachet in Washington that, without me, you'll be stuck even deeper with Iran, against which Washington doesn't really have a solution, neither against the military, the missile side of things, the nuclear side of things, or let alone the militia and the proxy side of things. We really are in a pickle when it comes to Iran. Iran's power on all these fronts seems to be rising. And I think the frequency of us tossing our hands in the air is just also rising with it, but little more than that, unfortunately. So that's going to, I mean, the detente between the Saudis and the Iranians is going to basically impact, what would be then Turkey's role in all of this. Vis-a-vis Russia, you know much better than I do. Turkey seems to have put itself in this again sweet spot. Like on the one hand, is providing the Bayraktar to the Ukrainians. There's a YouTube video about how the Ukrainians love the Bayraktar and sing about it. So that checks a lot of boxes in Washington and Europe. But then at the same time, it's working, hand in hand with the Russians in Syria. And Turkey also helps, Russia with its energy sector as well. I mean, for a while, Turkey was touting itself as being, the hub for gas and energy in the region and becoming an alternative to Russia that provides Europe with energy. But increasingly, we see that the Russians and the Turks actually work closer and closer. Including in the KRG, which was supposed to be part of the Turkish, grand schemes or plans for being an energy hub. So again, on the one hand, they get Russia and like Moscow and Ankara are getting closer. On the other hand, you have others in this town that argue that the only serious partner, of Washington that actually does something that really hurts the Russians, that would be the Bayraktar. It would be the Turks. So again, a sweet spot where they have not really angered either side, but they're also not fully with either side either. But this is Erdogan for you, right? He's always good at holding the stick right in the middle. And I think this is the uncertainty of the election where we go through. There's a lot inside Turkey that's going to go on, but I think in a way, and this is something that I heard again in Iraq, but also from some regional leaders that I asked, what do you think about the elections, and then what do you prefer about the elections? You hear this thing. Sometimes it's said bluntly, sometimes implied that there's a preference for the devil they know. And you hear this in Iraq, but also you also hear this in the Gulf, that there is just a ton of uncertainty. And I think Sinan and Meghan referred to the uncertainties of Turkish politics. The six that have come together, they have unity of purpose of defeating Erdogan. But other than that, they have little in common. And the Kurds may actually have also found unity of purpose around this. But as I referred to earlier, much of the Kurdish problem actually predates Erdogan. They're more structural, they're institutional, part of it is legal, part of it is kind of a knee-jerk reaction that is still there, and that sweet, the peace that we had for a while, the peace talk that existed, unfortunately were not long enough to result in a cultural shift, in a kind of a DNA shift that you don't get that knee-jerk reaction, that Erdogan cannot just go and villainize the Kurdish situation or the Kurdish situation for his elections. And you're absolutely right. If we go into a runoff, then Erdogan is going to look for someone to blame, and the Kurds are right up there.
Well, our discussion has touched on international organizations, multilateral affairs, nation states, Iran, Iraq, Turkey, Syria, United States, Russia, and other actors in the region, a little bit on religious groups, and then primarily about Turkey-Kurdish groups. Meghan, one more for you. During your trip to northeast Syria, there are other minority groups. What was their sentiment about what they've experienced in the claw operations and their feelings about the United States potentially departing the region for their own security? And could you describe this for both those who are here at home or here in the audience and those at home too?
Of course, no, that's a very important question. And one thing that it's important to note about northeast Syria and northern Iraq, Anatolia and Mesopotamia as a whole, is that these places have been incredibly diverse for thousands and thousands of years. And the process of the creation of the modern nation states of Turkey, Iran, Iraq, and Syria, out of that very diverse, multi-ethnic, multi-religious region, led to a great deal of violence and repression and displacement of many different communities. In Syria, many Syrian Kurds, but also other ethnic and religious minorities, including Yazidis, Syriacs, Assyrians, many communities in northeast Syria, they are the descendants of survivors of genocides and massacres in the late Ottoman Empire and the early Turkish Republic who fled down to Syria or were forced down to Syria in order to save themselves. In Iraq, Iraqi Kurdistan, also a very diverse region. This conflict, one of the places that we didn't get a chance to talk about and where I unfortunately haven't gotten a chance to go is Sinjar, the homeland of the Yazidis, where ISIS committed genocide in 2014. Since 2017, Turkey has been carrying out a campaign of targeted assassinations of Yazidi political and military leaders who fought ISIS, who took up arms to defend their community, on the grounds that these genocide survivors are terrorists because they accepted help from the PKK and the YPG when their people were faced with eradication. Of course, what's never asked here in this conversation is why Turkey, a major military power with a proven ability to strike in Iraq, did not lift a finger to stop ISIS when it was committing genocide against minorities in those regions. But anyway, these are diverse regions, and many of the ethnic and religious minorities there have a long history of surviving persecution by Turkey, by the Ottoman Empire previously, only to now feel like they're being faced with the same thing again. I had the chance to make it out to Tel Tamer, which is an Assyrian region along the Khabur River near Hasaka in northern Syria, where, of course, ISIS attacked that region in 2015. Many people were displaced then. Some tried to come back. But now Tel Tamer is on the front line between the SDF and Turkey and Turkish-backed armed groups in the areas that Turkey and its Syrian proxy forces have taken over, like Serikaniye, like Afrin. We've seen really terrible human rights violations against Kurds, against non-Muslim minorities, against women, particularly, women of Kurdish ethnicity, of other ethnicities, people perceived as being politically active or close to the autonomous administration. We've seen a lot of, very terrible persecution of these communities in the occupied zones. The United Nations, for example, has said that there are now essentially no Yazidis left in Afrin, that the conduct of Turkish-backed groups has created unlivable conditions for that community in Afrin, which was once one of the only Yazidi communities in the region safe from ISIS because the YPG and the YPJ ensured that ISIS never made it into Afrin. Now ISIS leaders get killed there every other month, and Turkey pretends that, well, we were spying on them, so clearly we're helping. It's like, there wouldn't have been any ISIS in Afrin without you. This is your fault. But no, this is not just a Kurdish issue or a Turkish issue. This is a conflict that impacts essentially every ethnic and religious group in the Middle East in at least 3 different countries. It impacts issues of global geopolitical importance, like the fight against ISIS. It even impacts, for example, the Ukraine conflict and NATO expansion. Why is it that Turkey is not allowing Sweden into NATO? Because Kurds in Sweden have free speech rights, and they can demonstrate in ways that offend Erdogan, and he believes that he ought to be able to apply Turkish law on free speech to Kurdish and Turkish diaspora communities and the people of European country as a whole. So this is an issue that is fundamentally not only about 1 or 2 ethnic groups or 1 country, but about basic questions of civil rights, of what political formations can best allow multi-ethnic, multi-religious regions to thrive, what political formations can best allow women to thrive. It's important, we mentioned Iran passingly in Turkish-Iranian relations, and there is that perception, as you said, that Turkey is necessary to stand against Iran. But think about it for a minute. What is the political force that's been doing the most to stand against, to challenge the Iranian regime's rule? It's a women-led, Kurdish-led political movement, an uprising where the main slogan is women, life, freedom, Jinjian Azadi. And they take that, of course, there's a very long history of Kurdish struggle in Iran as well, which we could have our own event on to get into that. But they adopted that slogan and that philosophy behind it of women's freedom being central to the freedom of society from the Kurdish movement in Turkey and in Syria. And they were inspired by, Kurdish women fighting, both against the Iranian regime for a long time since the 1940s and by the recent successes of Kurdish women from all parts of Kurdistan in the fight against ISIS in Syria, as members of groups like the YPJ. So it is these ideas that are, coming out of the situation, that are being put into practice in northeast Syria, that are addressing questions relevant to the entire region. And as several of our speakers brought up, if there can be a political solution that protects the autonomy of north and east Syria, if there can be a settlement in Turkey, based on these principles of democracy and decentralization and ethnic and religious pluralism, gender equality, women's liberation, you could take something that's been a devastating conflict that's, inflicted atrocities on all of these peoples in this region and turn it into something that ends with a settlement that could be a model for everywhere. And that's a huge opportunity.
That's great. Now let's have a huge opportunity for you all to ask your questions. Before you ask your questions, please state your name and your affiliation, and please end your question with a question mark. We'll have a microphone coming to you so everyone can hear you in the crowd and also people who are watching online. Questions, please.
If you don't raise your hand, we're going to start calling you at random.
We'll go in the back center first.
My name is Roger Cochetti. I am an author and editorial contributor to the Hill newspaper. And I might say, by the way, in the introductions for Molly, it was mentioned that she went to the Foreign Service School. When I studied at the Foreign Service School many decades ago, we were taught that Kurdish independence, Kurdish sovereignty, was a Soviet communist plot. Inspired, similar to the Viet Cong and other national liberation fronts. So that was doctrine in those days. So it shows you how much the world has changed. Much has been said about two of the world's great powers in this discussion, the United States and Russia, but nothing has been said about either China or Europe and their perspective on the Kurdish issues, in Syrian Kurdish issues, settlement in Syria, or the Turkish elections. Could anybody comment on any perspective or role that either the Chinese or the Europeans are playing in all of this? Thank you.
Just a quick comment on this. As Turkey has, with ISIS going into Syria and then Turkey's follow-on military actions and the refugee flow, the largest flow of human migration, I think, in the past decade, President Erdogan used the threat of sending more Syrians and more refugees into Europe, which has been one of his power positions. And really he's operated, in Turkey, has operated almost like a superpower within the region, able to use diplomacy, economics, military force, intelligence, and finance to assert the will of the president of Turkey. So that's one consideration in all of this, is the human aspect that Meghan has mentioned so often, that there's people involved in the decisions made in these capitals by political leaders, but more on the observations from China and Europe.
I mean, I'll comment on what you said about the perception of this conflict. I think that one of the reasons why it's so important that the U.S. is looking at this differently now is because there was, for a long time, a very absolutist Cold War framework that, like in parts of Latin America, in Asia, and Africa, led the United States to support essentially any sort of government as long as that government was U.S. aligned, and it didn't really matter what they did at home. And looking into the research I've done, we know that there are documents that suggest that the U.S. Trained several of the perpetrators of the 1980 military coup in Turkey, which led to the complete suspension of democracy, many people leaving as political refugees, arbitrary imprisonment, torture, all kinds of human rights violations. In fact, there are many people who argue that if that coup and the repression after it hadn't happened, because the harshest of that repression targeted the Kurds, you might not have even seen an armed Kurdish military campaign against the Turkish government at all. And the PKK themselves say, and when you hear their Kurdish leadership talk about the decision to fight, they say, well, look what they put us through before we'd fired a single shot at anyone. Sometimes you have to strike back. And the United States did not question what Turkey was doing with things like F-16s when the United States built Turkey's F-16 program. When villages were burned, when there was a lot of repression of legal pro-Kurdish politics, when there were assassinations of elected pro-Kurdish officials in the 1990s. The U.S. looked the other way because of this Cold War framework. And I think that, as you mentioned, we're moving out from looking at this way. And I think these ideas about, you can say national liberation, you can say self-determination, different people might say different things. Today, they're reflected in a lot of the founding documents of the international agreements that the US and Turkey share. You know, the OSCE founding documents mention minority rights and self-determination. And the vision of self-determination that Kurds are putting forward right now in Turkey and in Syria isn't changing any national borders. You know, this is not about separatism or the creation of a new state anymore. This is about the transformation of political and social relations within those states. And I know you asked about Europe and China. I can talk a little bit about Europe. A resolution to this conflict is very much in Europe's interests. There are large Turkish communities in Europe. There are large Kurdish communities in Europe. These are very politically active, politically engaged communities. And it would benefit Europe for there to be the kind of stability and democratization in Turkey, you know, the kind of stability in Syria. You know, these people who've become refugees, they don't want to become refugees. Nobody wants to leave their homeland. And if there were political settlements, if these people could return, if they could build meaningful and safe lives in the countries that they come from, if you had less political tensions between diaspora communities, all of these benefits in Turkey and in Syria would really benefit Europe. So Europe should be engaged in this. You know, unfortunately, sometimes they take a shorter-minded view, but yeah.
You mentioned values, and there are a lot of values that are shared between the autonomous administration of North and East Syria and the United States. One of them is that we have, for as much as we can, fairness and equality, where men and women have opportunities to come into leadership. And Ms. Sinan Muhammad here has a question in the front row. She is the autonomous administration's official representative in Washington, D.C. So we have a question here in the front row. Just a second, ma'am.
Hello, everyone. And I would like to thank the New Lines Institute and Kurdish Peace Institute for this really important topic today. My question is, Mr. Bilal, he mentioned that the honeymoon between the Kurdish people and the Turkey, what ends these honeymoons, do you think? I mean, it doesn't depend on the interest of the people of Turkey or Turkish interest. It depends on the interest of the personal, like Mr. Erdogan. This is the one question. Another question I would like to ask Dr. Sinan. What if Erdogan win? I mean, we have many scenarios. Maybe he wins or he will not. So what if he wins? Do you think that he will be getting another policy, foreign policy, toward US or the Western countries, so that he will be very away from the Western countries going toward other side? And this is what he is actually, I mean, thinking of, to be away from the, let us say, the covering of NATO. He doesn't want, so he wants to move as an independent country and a strong country, strategic, geostrategic, place. So he thought that he is the one that he can make everything alone. So do you think that he would be able to do that? My question to Meghan, thank you, Meghan, for your visit. So you are mentioning that it is not the issue only of the Kurdish, issue. Yes, I agree with you. It is the issue of all the people there, the component in Syria, as a Syria, Christians, Arabs, Kurds, all together. So that means it is the issue of democracy, a new system in Turkey or in Syria. To get the democracy, that means you will have the human rights, you have the women rights, you will have the other people rights in all of it, like equal, together like Kurds. So that time we will not have any problem in the issue of the rights of the Kurds. So because we have witnessed a lot of lack of the Kurdish rights in Syria and in Turkey, the people, they are asking to get their rights, to change these systems, which is the regime, let us say. And do you think that it will be, Turkey, if we can say the opposition wins, will be able to have this transition into a very democratic system so that it will be changing the face of Turkey, what it is now. So this is what I'm asking. Thank you so much for that. Thank you.
Thank you for your questions.
And I would like just to say I'm the representative of Syrian Democratic Council here.
Yes, the Syrian Democratic Council here, Representative Sana Mohammed. Panelists, if you could keep your responses tight, and then also in your responses, if you want to add any quick closing remarks, and I also invite you to recommend the attendees and viewers to follow you on social media, or if you have a book or article or report you want to pub, please do that. If you all could just tick through that right quick, and we'll close out.
Sure, I'll take a first crack. Well, first of all, thank you for your question. The danger of personalizing politics is exactly what you embedded in your question, right? It becomes about what is good for the person, for the leader. And this is something not new to the Middle East. And Turkey, by personalizing politics, became a Middle Eastern country in that sense, right? I mean, there was a phrase at some point that, you know, does Turkey want to be the last European country or the first Middle Eastern country? Well, the personalization of politics is a very Middle Eastern trait. And, you know, as I mentioned, when the Kurdish vote favored the AK party and Mr. Erdogan, you know, the Kurds were the good Kurds. And when that was no longer the case, when the genie was out of the bottle and the Kurdish vote, you know, went elsewhere, when the HDP didn't form a government with the AK party, then that was it. So it was not based on kind of an institutional decision, like a dialogue between, let's say, representatives of the Kurdish civil society, even if you argue that, you know, this is not the speaking directly with the PKK, as Meghan mentioned earlier. That was not institutional. And I think even when we talk about what happens if Mr. Erdogan were to lose, and again, it's a toss-up, it doesn't mean that Turkey is just going to kind of etch a sketch, go back to how things are going to be, you know, the democratic or... No. After 20 years of personalized rule, of putting, you know, loyalists, of loyalty, you know, trumping meritocracy, there is damage done inside the institutions. So we will be dealing with a different Turkey. And that's going to, you know, as Sinan mentioned, there will be some work, some reconstruction that needs to happen. So that's, I think, is one element. But the Kurdish situation is only one of them. You know, the Turkish relationship with Russia is like that, right? The Turkish relationship with Israel is like that. You know, during the elections, you see all the kind of rhetoric against Israel, and then, you know, rhetoric changes after the elections. With the Russians, you know, playing up the Russians and the Americans against each other. But I think to me, the crucial point after these elections, especially with Assad being back in the Arab League and being, you know, normalized, the detente between the Saudis and the Iranians, however, you know, short-lived that might be, and then this election, and then again this U.S. urge for just, you know, divesting, despite, you know, the speech that Mr. Sullivan gave at the Washington Institute last week. There is this sense in the region that the United States is disengaging, is divesting from the Middle East. So then what happens? You know, as General Votel said, what kind of voice do the Syrian Kurds have at the table, and what is that table going to be, and who is going to actually watch out for the right of the Kurds? Because oftentimes, I mean, despite having like 30 years of KRG experience, you know, of self-rule, of autonomy, you saw how the reaction, the regional and the international reaction to the referendum was. You know, since 2014 and 15, the SDF is at the heart of the fight against terrorism. All of the casualties and all of the suffering, but also you know, the effort that the Kurds were, you know, exerted in defeating ISIS, and yet they're still fighting for just still being at the table, despite 11,000 being killed. And Assad's language is the same as it was in 2000, you know, and 10. Nothing really has changed. So you can see that these maps and these borders don't really change. Realpolitik sometimes takes over. You mentioned Europe. You know, the Scandinavian countries, who have been historically the most friendly European countries, you know, between NATO and human rights, they chose NATO. So I think this is also just the sad reality of the Kurdish situation. So then that is why, Kurdish self-goals and, the disunity within is just going to be so much more costly. And this is true in the KRG, but I think that will be a challenge for the SDF as well moving forward. How can, given these regional changes, given the great power competition that's happening, some of the divestment fears about U.S. divestment in the Middle East, how can the Kurds actually save and safeguard what they have achieved, and perhaps build this so they can move forward? Turkey is a crucial element here. It has been that kind of vicious kind of opponent to everything Kurdish on the Iraqi side and the Turkish side. But again, after 20 years of single-man rule, I think in Turkey, there's just a lot of damage that we just, is not going to just be undone in a day or week, and that requires, I think, Kurdish agency as well as U.S. leadership, and I hope that we can see that U.S. leadership moving forward.
All right, thanks. If you could keep your responses at 30 seconds. Thanks.
I took his time.
That's okay. I mean, I don't have too much I think if Erdogan does win, I think it's the worst case scenario for going forward for the Kurdish cause, because I just don't think he has any new ideas of wanting to engage in a negotiated settlement. But I would also say if the ceasefire ends and Erdogan is in power, securitizing this issue and continuing to play on the Kurdish sort of enemy inside of Turkey against the PKK is going to be a lifeline to his political sort of popularity, because the Turkish population has already been sort of hypersensitized to this issue. But also, I would say, watch what happens in the space, with the Iranian-Saudi sort of reconciliation, or rapprochement, if you want to call it that. But in terms of how Syria moves forward with this, in terms of the fate of the Kurds going forward, I think there's going to be a sort of a huge temptation on the part of Erdogan to see how much he can manipulate the Syrian regime to see what he can get out of this as far as the settlement goes. Maybe some sort of revision of the Adana Accord. But I also don't think Assad is in a mood to sort of give Erdogan what he wants. We'll see.
Yeah, it's all in the report. In terms of Syria, resolving this broader conflict is how you end one forever war and prevent the next one. In terms of what's going to happen in Turkey, I think the most immediate thing the U.S. should be doing is making it clear that some public acknowledgement of the fact that this ceasefire is something beneficial, and maybe even, perhaps not public, but private messaging that no matter who wins the election, it ought to be extended for that same purpose of preventing, new escalation, particularly if there's a period between a first and a second round, and maybe offering some incentives to the Kurdish side for de-escalation there. But there's a lot more on how all of that happened, what more the U.S. can do, other policies to reassess, and what can be done to support a peaceful and democratic solution to the Kurdish question in the report. So please read it. Thank you all for attending, and thank you for your questions.
On behalf of the New Lines Institute and the Kurdish Peace Institute, we want to thank our panelists and thank all of you all for participating today. Have a good one. For those here at the University Club, you're invited.